What's up, everybody? Welcome to my Week 10 Cash Game review. My name is Ben Hauver. Today, I'm going to be going over the Week 10 Cash Game lineup that I rolled out on DraftKings. It was a good week, high output, high production, and yeah, it's always fun to talk about these on the good weeks. So yeah, we'll get right into that. If you like this content, you can follow me on Twitter at Ben Hauver, BenHauver. Subscribe on YouTube, etc., etc. But let's get right into it. So, I think the major decision point and the thing that really was going to shape your lineup construction this week really came down to which running backs you played. I think that there were about 6 guys who were, pretty viable for cash this week on Week 10 on DraftKings. So those 6 guys: Christian McCaffrey, Jalen Samuels, David Montgomery, Devin Singletary, Ronald Jones, and then late Sunday morning, Damian Williams entered the equation. So the way I looked at it was essentially this: Christian McCaffrey and David Montgomery for me were locks, and then it was really just a matter of figuring out among Jalen Samuels, Devin Singletary, and Ronald Jones which guy to play. As you can see from the lineup, on the screen, I ended up going with Damian, but that wasn't really in consideration until, an hour and a half before lock. So, CMC, for obvious reasons, the 10.5K salary didn't really, scare me off whatsoever. I mean, third straight game with 100 plus yards on the ground, hit the bonus. He had 6 receptions for 33 yards as well and a touchdown. While he didn't, hit value in quotes, getting 3x, it doesn't really matter. 29.1 points when you can lock in such guaranteed points into your lineup, for 10.5K, I think that, you got to do it. The price is still not prohibitive. And he's at the same price next week, taking a quick look ahead. So I think that, again, we're probably going to bounce back and play CMC for, just another straight week. And, he only came in at just about 40% ownership in the massive $25 double up, which I think was surprising. But, I guess it's just because there were so many other guys, these guys that we're about to talk about that, people felt comfortable going away from McCaffrey. And, I think that was honestly a mistake. But we'll get into it. And the other guy that I played that really, tanked almost all of my GPP teams and could have been disastrous in cash was David Montgomery, who, was in the nut matchup, was, in the nut price. Once we found out that Stafford was, going to be out, I think it just, increased the likelihood of a positive game script for him at home in Chicago. And, he ended up only having 60 rushing yards on 17 touches, an abysmal 3.5 yards per carry, 0 receptions, 0 glory at the goal line, and just an absolute, bottom of the barrel, output from David Montgomery. I guess that perhaps we had overvalued his recent, pass game role. I didn't really think that 0 receptions was in play for him in this spot, but I guess, obviously it was, and, that burned me. But luckily, 69.2% owned in cash games. I think he was the second highest owned player behind Michael Thomas, who we'll get to in a little while. But, while he did burn me, he burned just about everybody else as well. So, it didn't hurt as badly as it could have. And then really, between the other 3 guys, Devin Singletary, Ronald Jones, and Jalen Samuels, that's where the biggest decision came into play, I think. So starting with Singletary, who I was on for most of the week, but grudgingly, I was really looking for a way to get up to Jalen Samuels. That was what I wanted to do. Samuels had seen a price increase from last week when he was chalk at 4K, and finished with 13 receptions on 13 targets. This week he had 10 less receptions, in the same feature role at a higher price. So, luckily wasn't able to get up to there. And I think that his price did become prohibitive, at 6.3K. It was just really difficult to get there when you had Christian McCaffrey and Michael Thomas as plays, and chances are you were playing a quarterback above 6.5K, as there were really only 3 guys, I think, in play, and all of them were 6.5 or higher on DraftKings. So, Samuels was kind of out of reach, more so than, somebody I tried to avoid. Luckily, it worked out that, I couldn't get there. And then Singletary, right? In week 9, touched the ball 23 times for the first time in his young career, had more than 10 touches in a game. And I think that most people, myself included, really assumed that the torch had been passed at this point, right? I think that, it was well within the range of outcomes. However, for his season averages in terms of opportunity to be more in line with what happened. And I think that, that's exactly what happened. Had 11 touches in week 10, only 8 points. Frank Gore had a touchdown in the red zone, and it happens in fantasy, right? Like, Singletary obviously is going to be the more productive fantasy back for the Bills going forward. It just didn't happen this week, and I think that, it was pretty smart to get off of him if you just, ran into it paying 5K and assumed that he was going to get 20 plus touches again. I think that was just recency bias. And I talked about that with my co-hosts on the DFS Dose podcast, and we all agreed on that. By early Sunday morning, it really came down to, Ronald Jones, and then we got this Damian Williams news. Now, Ronald Jones, he won the starting job. There was a lot made of that. Only had 11 attempts, averaging, just an absolutely garbage 2.6 yards per carry on that. But, the shocking part and what really allowed him to hit value, right, was that he got 8 targets, and he caught all 8 of them. Now, that was easily a career high for him. He'd never really seen that kind of usage in the pass game. Had a touchdown, had a fumble. All in all, equated to 23.6 points on DK, comfortably 5xing his value. And, I had him in there all the way up until, about 12 o'clock, an hour before lock over here on the Eastern, time zone. And, once Damian Williams became available, we found out that LaShawn McCoy was a healthy scratch. I think that his pass game, work role was a lot more predictable. He ended up only having 5 receptions on 5 targets, but still he outtouched the rest of the KC backfield 24-5, 19 carries, 5 receptions. And they had really comparable ownership, which, shout out to people playing on DraftKings. They're getting sharper and sharper. And we saw that in that, with only an hour and a half's notice, Damian Williams, basically equaling out ownership in cash games to a guy like Rojo, who is pretty much, destined to be chalk, from early in the week. So, one of the reasons I switched to Damian Williams was, like I said, I didn't really think that his pass game role was, safe. I thought that, much more likely was, maybe an 18 to 20 rush attempts and then maybe, 1 to 3 receptions or so. And obviously that wasn't the case, but, the way that my lineup was constructed beforehand, I had Jameis Winston in there. I'll talk about that in a second, but, I didn't really think there was much correlation there. I think they kind of capped each other's upside because I thought that, the opportunity of Ronald Jones to get significant pass work, was directly, in opposition to Jameis Winston's ceiling game. So, I was actively, looking to get off of Ronald Jones, and Damian Williams provided the perfect opportunity. And, I had Ronald Jones and Curtis Samuel in my lineup up to that point with 200 left on the board. Damian Williams 600 more than Rojo, easily went down from Curtis Samuel to Darius Slayton and then up to Damian Williams at this point. It ended up being a 14.9 point difference, no thanks to Damian Williams, who got outscored by Rojo, but thanks to Darius Slayton over Curtis Samuel, which, I'll talk about when I get to the wide receivers, but, ended up working out in my favor. I was well above the cash line, well more than 14.9 points. So that particular, switch 2v2 there wouldn't have done much either way in terms of results, at least in double ups. But yeah, so ended up working out in that way. And, Damian Williams, I think 14.9 points in a game where KC puts up 32 and he, gets 24 touches is, on the lower side of the spectrum in terms of what we could expect from him with that kind of workload. But, even so, great cash play at that price, starting running back for KC, no doubt about it. And then, so at quarterback, I ended up rolling famous Jameis here. I talked about it earlier. There were really only 3 guys I think that were in major cash consideration. It was Winston, it was Kyler, and it was Lamar Jackson. Obviously, Lamar Jackson was the nut play, but, he was 500 more than Winston. I just didn't think you could get there, in terms of construction. And, Kyler ended up being a better play than Jameis as well. Kyler scored 7 more points than Winston. Lamar scored about 10 more points. And, Kyler had developed some pretty, stark home road splits through his young career. Obviously, it's a small sample size, and he completely torched that expectation this week, throwing his first touchdown on the road, throwing multiple touchdowns on the road this week. And, just the way I was looking at it, I thought that Winston was a little bit safer at home in this spot than Kyler Murray, but, Kyler smashed value, and, Winston still ended up getting there. He had a pretty clear path, I think, to a 300-yard bonus passing, which he did hit. And, there were some splits in terms of which defenses and which schemes, Winston does well against. And I kind of bought into that, thinking, the Cardinals play predominantly man coverage, which is going to be really hard to stop the Bucks with, considering their wide receivers, Godwin and Evans, and despite throwing 2 interceptions in this spot, I really didn't think that a Winston meltdown game was in play. He hit the 300-yard bonus, had 40 yards on the ground to, sort of, make up for those interceptions. And it really just came down to him scoring 1 passing touchdown, on a day that the Bucks, put up 30 points at home. So, I think that was kind of him running bad in a way. Peyton Barber, Ronald Jones each had a touchdown on the ground. It just didn't really work out for Jameis in this spot. But, the rest of the lineup more than made up for it. So let's move on to wide receiver here. A.J. Brown, just the ultimate bust, right? I mean, if you had told me that Tennessee was going to win in a shootout against the Chiefs, 67 total points in this game, the Titans put up 35 points, beat the Chiefs, and they did it with no Corey Davis. A.J. Brown played a season high 94% of snaps, and, all he contributed to this monster offensive output by the Titans, 1 reception, 17 yards, 2.7 DraftKings points, just, complete garbage. He was owned by about a fourth of the teams out there, 26.7% in the massive double up, to be exact. And, you hate to see it. But, thankfully, the other 2 guys in this lineup more than made up for it, starting off with Godius Slayton, a.k.a. Darius Slayton. As I talked about, he was part of a pivot, up to Damian Williams and off of Curtis Samuel. And, I had been on Slayton all week. I think that there were a lot of reasons to like him. Obviously, he ran hot, putting up 37.1 DK points, and, only 3.1% of people played him in cash. But, apart from him just fitting the build, I think that there were legit reasons to think that Darius Slayton could go off in this spot. No, I'm not talking about a 40-point game, but I think that, a good game was still, within his range. He got 10 of his 14 targets, 121 yards, 2 touchdowns, and the Jets struggle. They're not a run funnel, but they're like a run funnel light. They're better against the running back than they are against the pass, and they're worse against the deep pass more so, than the intermediate game. There was no Sterling Shepard, no Evan Ingram, and we couldn't have predicted that Saquon would bust the way he did, but this game went off. A ton of points in this game, and Darius Slayton was a pure beneficiary of that. And just, he's developing into, a really good player, to be honest, a legit deep threat, a good contested catch specialist, and Slayton, paid off massively in this spot, really, compensated for some of the worst plays in my lineup, including Montgomery and A.J. Brown. So, shout out to Darius Slayton. The boys on the podcast called me a fish for playing him in cash, considering him in cash. And, how do you like me now? Just kidding. And then, finally, Michael Thomas, right? So he was massive chalk. Owned in 71.2% of lineups in the massive $25 double up, and completely lit it up, even in a game where the Saints let down in a major way, right? They only scored 9 points at home against one of the worst defenses in the league. Still, he managed to put up 31.2 points on DraftKings, caught 13 of his 14 targets, 152 yards, secured the 100-yard bonus, and is well on pace to break Marvin Harrison's single-season catch record. And, if we take a peek ahead to next week, maybe you're on DFS Twitter and, you've seen this, but, MT has been priced up significantly. He's priced all the way up to 9,900 next week, 100 shy of the record for a wide receiver on DraftKings in the history of the game. I know Antonio Brown was 10K a few years ago, and, this might be a hot take, but I think that Michael Thomas justifies that price. He's a rare player in this season, in this league, like Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey showed it against the 49ers in an absolutely abysmal effort by his team where they got blown out by the 49ers a couple weeks ago. He still put up 30 points because of the usage he gets. And Michael Thomas, is that same kind of player. He's averaging 25.8 DraftKings points per game over his last 4, and only one of those, 1 touchdown in that span. So, yeah, I think that when you're getting that kind of production all off of usage, off of targets and receptions, and you're converting, over 90% of your targets, you're just going to be worth worth that price, worth almost a fifth of your DraftKings salary. So, Michael Thomas, I'll talk about it more on my Thursday cash pool video where I go over every cash viable player on the slate. But, Michael Thomas at 9,900 sounds insane to consider a wide receiver at that price, but we're going to have to legitimately look at it, the way Michael Thomas is producing at a historic level this season. And the last thing I want to talk about before I move on to tight end and defense here is, the choice I made to fade Christian Kirk in this spot. Christian Kirk for me was never really in cash consideration, and he ended up being one of the most popular. I think he was the second most popular wide receiver behind Thomas in cash games. And, over the last 4 weeks, I just didn't see it, right? He's alternating double-digit target games with 5-target games, 11 targets, 5 targets, 12 targets, 5 targets. And in week 9, he played over 80% of his snaps outside, which we know the Cardinals like to target their slot far more than they like to target, the outside wide receivers. Now, yes, Christian Kirk absolutely smashed this week, put up 40 points. And, there's no denying that he ran hot. He ran lava hot, 3 touchdowns on 6 receptions. You can't say nobody expected that, even though a majority of people played him in cash. But, for 5.2K, on DraftKings with somebody who, in 50% of outcomes is going to get 5 targets, even in a great matchup, for me on the road with a quarterback who had yet to throw a single passing touchdown on the road, it was just a flat out bad play, I think. And, maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe it was take lock. But, I was never really going to go there. And, I think that, if you were one of the 56% of people who, didn't play Christian Kirk in cash, you don't have to really think that that was a terrible play. I don't at all. I think that, there were a lot of reasons to not go there despite the results. That being said, if you were one of those people, you probably, really, really felt that burn unless, of course, you play Darius Slayton, a.k.a. Godius Slayton, like I did. So, yeah, I know that a lot of us out there probably really felt that Christian Kirk, 3 touchdown game in a major way. In terms of DraftKings this week. So, yeah, there's that. Moving on to tight end here. I ate the chalk with Gesicki. Not much to say. He busted 4.8 points in cash, and Rhett Ellison, who was really the only other cash tight end with significant ownership, only scored 7.2. So it was kind of a wash. I think that, at 38% ownership in cash, Gesicki was, everyone was going to play him, and I think that there were definitely a lot of paths to this result. We all jumped on him after, his highest, output in his career, and almost assumed that he was going to be, doing that on a weekly basis. Now that was a dumb assumption, it turned out, and despite, the Dolphins winning this game, they really didn't get much out of Gesicki, and, fortunately, it doesn't really matter what tight end you played, unless you were one of the 1 or 2% of people who played Mark Andrews in cash. Chances are this week it was just a straight wash for you at tight end. And then the last thing I want to talk about here is the Steelers defense. Now, I'm not usually one to prioritize defense in any way whatsoever. And what I mean by that is that, it really comes down to just letting what fits ride. You look for a cheap defense, you look for a defense playing at home, and then maybe you look for a turnover-prone quarterback. And, the Steelers to me really stood out this week. They were averaging the most fantasy points per game of any defense, on the slate. All of the defenses above 3K, the 4K defense, the Steelers were the highest average. And, they had 6 straight games with 11 or more points, coming into the week. They play super aggressive. They blitz. They get sacks. They get turnovers. And, Goff's road struggles are well known. And while I kind of did expect the Browns to win this game, and I thought that they were a decent play when you consider that they were cheap and they were at home and Josh Allen is a turnover-prone quarterback, the Steelers to me just made so much more sense, just in terms of a cash play and just in terms of a high ceiling. And it turns out that they hit that ceiling, 25 points, 4 sacks, 3 picks, a defensive touchdown, just a monster game. And, that was going to be one of the closest or most impactful decisions I think that you could have made on the slate. It was a $100 difference between the Steelers and the Browns, and it was a 23-point difference in terms of output. So huge swing depending on where you went there. But I'm just honestly shocked that the Steelers only equated to be owned by about 14% of people in these massive double ups. I just think that, they were an obvious play, very affordable, and should have been, a lot higher owned. No two ways about it. But, that's going to be really it. 174 0.12 points on the week, won 80.49% of head-to-heads, 8 out of 8 double-ups cash. The ROI was 44.31%. So yeah, just, high-end week. It was a good week in cash games, and, always fun to talk about that. But I will be back, on Thursday to talk about every cash viable player for the week 11 main slate on DraftKings, and then Monday again with a cash review. Hopefully, again, it will be another happy one with great results. So, yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, like I said, at Ben Hauver, BenHauver. Guys, thank you so much for listening to this and watching this video.